All right, everyone. So this is going to be a quick overview of some tips for designing an English language arts lesson. All right. So let's start with this. First thing we want to start with is the first component of backward design, which is identifying desired results, right? What are the big ideas and skills that we're going to be teaching for the day? Now, what we typically do is we start with our content standards. So here we have two content standards: analyze how particular lines of a dialogue or incidents in a story or a drama propel the action, reveal aspects of character, etc., etc. And then develop the topic. This is in writing here. So here's a reading standard in literature, RL, and here's a writing standard. Develop the topic with relevant, well-chosen facts, definitions, concrete details, etc. So you're looking for standards, reading, writing, listening, speaking, grammar, that are natural overlaps that you can bundle together. So in this case, these are the two that I'm going to tackle with my students for the day. Now, from those standards, I want to develop learning objectives. And these learning objectives, we want to communicate clearly to our students, and that's why they need to be worded in student-friendly terms. So from the standard, this is what I could put in front of kiddos, either on the board or on a slide, or just talk about. Today, we're going to analyze particular lines in a story to determine why some of these characters think, act, and speak the way they do. So notice that it's derived from this, but it's more student-friendly language. So instead of developing the topic with all of this, I could say to students or communicate or write this on the board: we want you to be able to come to your own conclusion or conclusions about the actions of a character and then support that with evidence from the text. So we take our learning and we take our content standards and turn them into learning objectives by looking at, what are the key knowledge and skills, and then rewording that in a way that's student friendly. All right. Now we move on to the second component of backward design, which is to determine what would acceptable evidence look like. What are the assessment pieces that we're going to gather at the end of this lesson to determine to what degree kids have mastered these objectives? All right, so let's take a look at these learning objectives we came up with. Analyze particular lines in a story to determine why characters think, act, and speak the way they do. What would make sense? What would be logical evidence of that? And then asking students to come to their own conclusions about the actions of a character and support it with evidence from the text. So remember, this was rooted in the reading standards. This was rooted in the writing standards. That might help us decide what sort of evidence it is that we could and should collect. So in this case, I've decided to take a story. It's high interest, appropriate reading level for most of my students, and I will support and accommodate the ones that are going to need that. But we've got a text. This is Hop Frog, a short fiction story, and then questions that specifically are designed to ask kiddos to do what? To analyze particular lines in the story about the way characters think, why characters think, act, and speak the way that they do. And then after they do that, in this case, to help them meet this objective, what we're going to do is give them a writing prompt that requires them to come to and defend a conclusion about why a character did such and such or acts, whatever it is, based on evidence from the text, and make the rubric for that very, very clear to our students. Okay. So again, we've gone through and we started by identifying the desired results. We came up with our learning objectives. Then we determine acceptable levels of evidence. And that brings us to the next part, which is to plan the actual learning experiences. We put this together in the flow of a lesson. So we might use a format like this, kind of a modified direct instruction approach, where we greet students at the door and get them started on a warm-up task. We use an anticipatory set or learning hook to orient them towards the task, introduce the learning goals, get relevance and interest fired up. And then we're going to teach new concepts and skills and give them opportunities to practice those skills, provide them feedback as they do so, and then ask them to apply those skills in a much more challenging context, in a higher order thinking task, right? And then at the end of the lesson, we'll provide closure. So now we're finally in this part where we're designing the learning experience. So for example, we could start with this. We could greet students at the door and get them started immediately on a warm-up task. So this might, excuse me, this might in this case be a review of past terms that are relevant to what we're going to be tackling. So these might be literary terms such as external and internal conflict, parallel episodes, protagonist, antagonist, a warm-up of things that we've review and a recap of things that we've covered in the past that feed into this. And then we might, as a learning hook, a short anticipatory set. Remember, we're trying to pique their interest, access some prior knowledge, also introduce a learning goal and essential questions. We could put this image or an image like this up there and say, okay, what does it look like is happening in this picture? Under what circumstances is it okay or not okay to get even with somebody? Okay, and have them write down their own thoughts, and then take some time and discuss with their partners and hear their thoughts, and maybe have a little bit of share out in the class, all in just a couple minutes. And as long as it takes to pique their interest, introduce the learning goals, and then we'd hit them with these essential questions like we have here, and communicate the learning objectives and say, actually, what we're going to tackle today is about this. And it's about this. What we want you to be able to do is analyze particular lines in a story and figure out, why does a character act or think or do or say certain things? And then after that, you're going to come to your own conclusions, and you're going to support that with evidence from the text. So we're going to analyze or look closely at a text to figure out why this is going on. And then we're going to flip it around and come to our own conclusions and use information that we found in the text and our own ideas to explain to further explain our explanation of what's happening. All right. So now since this is an 8th grade standard, we might go with something a little less gory. We might go with something like this, or maybe even something a little bit more cartoony. So we do want to make sure that even though we're trying to get our students' attention, everything is at grade level appropriateness. All right. So at that point, we might dive in and read and listen to a dramatic reading of the story Hop Frog. We're going to use some evidence-based learning or teaching approaches and make sure that we model and scaffold along the way. So as we go through the story, we might pause and tackle some of these questions together about why characters act, speak, or say certain things, and try and back that up with evidence from the text. And then as our students get more proficient with it, and we're able to give them some feedback on how to do this, they become more autonomous, and then they might do some with partners and maybe finish it up on their own. But the idea is that we're teaching the new concepts and content, and also providing a structure in place where they're learning how to be successful, and they're developing more and more autonomy. Okay, and this is what they'd submit as evidence to what degree can they meet that first learning objective. Remember what that first learning objective was? Analyzing particular lines in a story to determine, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's take a look at what might come next. Give me 2 seconds here. Just trying to get my act together, folks. All right, so the very next part would be, let's see if we can get them to apply this at a higher level, in a higher level thinking task. And in this case, this is where we might tackle maybe the writing standard. Okay, and it doesn't always have to be reading then writing, but this is just one approach here for these 2 particular standards. We might pose to them this question. After reading the story, Hop Frog enacted brutal revenge on the king and his counselors. In fact, if you're not familiar with the story, he actually tricked them into putting tar all over themselves, and then he chained them up, pretend they were playing some baboon game, and then just burnt them all to this fiery crisp. It was absolutely horrific. Okay, and so we might give them this prompt that says, the act was so brutal it probably even made the story's author, Edgar Allan Poe, wince when he came up with it. But the bottom line is this: Hop Frog was a captive, and he disposed of the king and his counselors, not just to get revenge, but to free his friend and himself from hostile captivity. So the question we find ourselves running into is violent revenge ever justified? So students are asked to formulate their own response and consider examples from the story and from the lives of people and reminding them their response will be evaluated with a predetermined set of criteria. And this criteria should be clearly aligned with that we're evaluating them on needs to be clearly aligned with the learning goal itself and the standard that's being taught. Okay, so then we provide them this writing prompt, and we're not just going to throw them into it. We're going to break down these individual steps, right? They might visit with their group members to answer the following. In what ways was Hop Frog's violent revenge justified? In what ways was it not justified? Excuse me, fighting the cough. Okay, we might actually provide some models or some sample responses that don't, mess up their ability to come to their own conclusions, but it might help them see how they might formulate their response or something like that. But notice that we're modeling and scaffolding the writing process. Okay, and then since that is our evidence piece for the second learning goal, we might consider bringing it all to a close in some sort of closure activity. Remember, at the end of the lesson, provide closure and opportunities for students to bring together and make sense of new information and skills. So we might have an exit ticket, might say something like, in your own words, explain and summarize each of the events in the story that led to Hop Frog's revenge. This is their ability to go back and identify key details and talk about why characters did particular things. And then at the end, how justified do you think Hop Frog's actions were? And they might report it. So this is just a very, very quick activity to bring it all in. Then they might have one final opportunity to discuss with their partners in smaller groups and maybe even share out with the class. But the idea is throughout the lesson, we're trying to meet these learning objectives, and we're seeking to gather evidence of students' ability to meet 1 or 2 or 3 or however many learning objectives there are. So to recap, we start with the first part of backward design, identifying desired results, focus on the big ideas and skills that we want our students to develop. Okay. Then we figure out, second step here, what's acceptable evidence? What would be the assessment piece that we would do for each of those learning objectives? And we design that. And it's only after that do we go on to the final step, which is actually to plan the learning experiences and instruction, put that together in a format and a flow to help move students along and give them an opportunity to grow and develop these skills in a way that's meaningful to them. And so with that, we've talked about what? We've talked about just a few tips for designing an English language arts lesson.